She just wanted to escape an ex who was destroying her insides. So, in the middle of a crowded room, she hugged the first man she saw, a complete stranger. But what he did next, no one expected. He held her as if he knew her pain. What began as a disguise became something impossible to ignore. Who was this man? Why did he seem to be keeping secrets bigger than hers? This story will move you, so let's subscribe to our channel. That way, others will be moved too. Stay until the end, because the ending is as real as it is surprising. Clara adjusted the delicate silver bracelet on her wrist for the third time in 10 minutes, a nervous habit she'd developed over the past few months. The grand ballroom of the Grosvenor House Hotel stretched before her, filled with London's elite in their finest evening wear. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over conversations, punctuated by gentle laughter and the soft clink of champagne glasses. "You look beautiful tonight," her friend Sarah whispered, squeezing Clara's arm reassuringly. "That dress is perfect on you." Clara smoothed down the midnight blue silk dress she'd borrowed for the occasion. It was the first formal event she'd attended in over a year, and every fibre of her being wanted to turn around and walk straight back to her small flat in Clapham. But Sarah had been persistent, insisting that Clara needed to get out, to live again. "I still can't believe you convinced me to come to a charity gala," Clara murmured, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. The bubbles tickled her nose as she took a tentative sip. "The Children's Hospital Foundation does incredible work," Sarah replied, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in these circles. "And you've been hiding away for too long. It's time to remind yourself that there's a whole world out there." Clara nodded, though her stomach remained knotted with anxiety. For months, she'd been building a new life, brick by brick. A small marketing job, a cozy apartment, Sunday morning runs through Battersea Park. Simple pleasures that felt revolutionary after years of having her every move monitored and controlled. The orchestra began playing a gentle waltz, and couples moved toward the dance floor. Clara watched them with a mixture of longing and fear. Once, she'd loved to dance. Once she'd moved through rooms like this with confidence. "Clara Sullivan, is that really you?" The voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade. Clara's champagne glass nearly slipped from her fingers as she turned, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. There, approaching with that familiar predatory smile, was Marcus. He looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, impeccably dressed, his dark hair perfectly styled. But now she could see what she'd been blind to before. The calculating look in his eyes, the way his smile never quite reached them, the subtle arrogance in his posture that suggested he owned whatever room he entered. "Marcus," her voice came out as barely a whisper. "You look stunning," he said, his gaze traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "I've been hoping we'd run into each other. I've missed you." Sarah stepped closer, sensing the shift in Clara's demeanor, but Marcus ignored her completely. His attention was fixed entirely on Clara, just as it always had been. Possessive, overwhelming, suffocating. I need to..." Clara took a step backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm. The conversations around them faded into white noise as Marcus continued to advance, his smile growing wider. "We need to talk," he said, reaching for her arm. "I know things ended badly between us, but I've changed. I've been thinking about us, about what we had." What we had. The words echoed in Clara's mind, bringing with them a flood of memories she'd spent months trying to forget. The constant criticism disguised as concern, the isolation from friends and family, the way he'd made her question her own perception of reality until she'd barely recognized herself. Panic rose in her throat like bile. She couldn't breathe. The elegant ballroom began to spin around her, and she knew with horrible certainty that she was about to have a panic attack in front of hundreds of London's social elite, and worse, in front of him. In that moment of pure terror, her eyes found a man standing near the bar. He was tall, wearing a navy blue tuxedo that fit him perfectly, his dark hair slightly tousled as if he'd run his fingers through it. Something about his calm presence, his stillness in the midst of all the social chaos, called to her like a beacon. Without thinking, without planning, without any consideration for consequences or propriety, Clara moved. Her body acted on pure instinct, the same instinct that had finally given her the courage to leave Marcus 18 months ago. She crossed the space between them in seconds and threw her arms around the stranger's neck, pressing herself against him as if they were lovers reunited after a long separation. "Darling," she whispered desperately against his ear, hoping he would understand, praying he wouldn't push her away. "I've been looking everywhere for you." For a moment that felt like eternity, the man stood perfectly still. Then, slowly, his arms came up around her waist, holding her gently but securely. She felt the solid warmth of his chest against hers, smelled the subtle scent of his cologne, something clean and expensive that made her feel inexplicably safe. "I'm here now," he murmured, his voice low and reassuring. The stranger's arms tightened around Clara, just enough to convey protection without possession. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the calm confidence in the way he held himself. When she dared to glance over his shoulder, she saw Marcus standing frozen several feet away, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. "Who is this?" Marcus demanded, his voice carrying the edge Clara remembered all too well. The man's hand moved to rest gently at the small of Clara's back as he turned slightly, keeping her sheltered within the circle of his arms while facing Marcus directly. Clara was amazed at how he managed to look completely relaxed while positioning himself as a subtle barrier between her and her ex. "Edward Hawthorne," he said simply, extending his free hand with the kind of easy courtesy that spoke of excellent breeding. His voice held just the right note of polite inquiry, as if he were genuinely curious about who Marcus might be, rather than threatened by his obvious hostility. Marcus hesitated before taking the offered hand, and Clara could see him trying to place the name, to determine where Edward fit in London's complex social hierarchy. She was grateful for the distraction it provided, giving her precious moments to steady her breathing and regain her composure. "Marcus Whitfield," he replied, his grip lingering a moment too long in what Clara recognized as a power play. "Clara and I have history." "I see," Edward replied mildly, reclaiming his hand without any visible reaction to Marcus's attempt at intimidation. "Well, it's always nice to meet Clara's old friends." The word "friends" carried just enough emphasis to make it clear that Edward understood exactly what kind of history they shared, and that he didn't find it particularly threatening. Clara felt a surge of gratitude mixed with amazement. How did this complete stranger read the situation so perfectly? "We were actually just catching up," Marcus pressed, his jaw tightening slightly. "Weren't we, Clara?" For the first time since spotting Marcus across the room, Clara found her voice. "Actually, Edward and I were about to dance." She was surprised by how steady she sounded, how natural the lie came to her lips. Edward's response was immediate and seamless. "Of course, darling. They're playing our song." He turned to Marcus with a smile that was perfectly polite and completely dismissive. "If you'll excuse us." Before Marcus could respond, Edward was guiding Clara toward the dance floor, with the kind of natural grace that suggested this wasn't his first charity gala. His hand remained at her back, warm and reassuring, as they moved through the crowd of well-dressed couples. "Can you actually dance?" Clara whispered as they reached the edge of the parquet floor. "Boarding school," he replied with a slight smile. "Mandatory cotillion classes. Can you?" "I used to." The admission came out more wistfully than she'd intended. "Then let's see if it comes back to you." His hand slipped into hers while his other arm encircled her waist with just the right amount of formal distance. As they began to move to the gentle rhythm of the waltz, Clara was amazed to find that her body remembered the steps. More than that, she felt safe for the first time in months. "Thank you," she murmured, as they turned gracefully around the floor. "I don't know what I would have done if—" "You don't need to explain," Edward said quietly. "I could see you were in distress." She looked up at him then, really looked at him for the first time since throwing herself into his arms. His face was strong but kind, with dark eyes that seemed to see everything without judging any of it. There were small lines at the corners of those eyes that suggested he laughed often, and his mouth had a gentle curve that spoke of natural warmth rather than practiced charm. "You're very trusting," Clara observed. Most men would have pushed away a strange woman who suddenly grabbed them at a party. "Most women don't look quite so terrified when they're grabbing strange men," he replied. "Besides, you said please." "I did, with your eyes." The simple honesty of the statement made Clara's breath catch. When was the last time someone had looked at her closely enough to read her expressions? When had anyone cared enough to respond to an unspoken plea? As the song wound toward its conclusion, Clara became aware that they had drawn the attention of several other couples. She caught glimpses of curious glances, the kind of speculative looks that suggested people were trying to place them as a couple. "People are staring," she whispered. "Let them," Edward replied calmly. "Would you like to get some air? There's a terrace that leads to the hotel gardens." The idea of escape was suddenly overwhelmingly appealing. Clara nodded, and Edward skillfully guided them off the dance floor and toward a set of French doors she hadn't noticed before. As they stepped out into the cool London evening, she breathed deeply for what felt like the first time all night. The terrace was lit by soft garden lights, and the noise from the ballroom faded to a gentle murmur behind the glass doors. Clara realized she was still holding Edward's hand and started to pull away, but he gave her fingers a gentle squeeze. "Are you all right?" he asked simply. The question, delivered without prying or pressure, nearly undid her completely. She had spent so many months learning to be all right on her own that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone simply ask. "I am now," she said, and was surprised to find that it was true. 3 days later, Clara found herself standing outside a small cafe in Covent Garden, questioning every decision that had led her to this moment. She'd given Edward her phone number at the gala, something she hadn't done for any man since leaving Marcus, and when he'd called the next day to ask if she'd like to meet for coffee, she'd surprised herself by saying yes. The cafe was nothing like the grand hotel where they'd met. It was cozy and unpretentious, with mismatched furniture and the kind of gentle buzz that spoke of regular customers and good coffee. Through the window, she could see Edward already seated at a corner table, reading a newspaper and looking remarkably relaxed in dark jeans and a soft grey sweater. Taking a deep breath, Clara pushed through the door, the small brass bell announcing her arrival. Edward looked up immediately, his face brightening with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at seeing her. "You came," he said, rising to greet her. "You sound surprised." "Cautiously hopeful," he corrected with a smile. "Can I get you something? The coffee here is excellent, and I'm told the pastries are made by someone's grandmother who refuses to share her recipes." Clara found herself smiling back. "Coffee sounds perfect. Black, please." "Marie?" As Edward approached the counter, Clara settled into the chair across from his, noting the worn copy of The Guardian folded beside his coffee cup. She tried to imagine Marcus in a place like this and failed completely. He would have chosen somewhere expensive, somewhere that announced his success to anyone who might be watching. "One perfectly black coffee for the lady," Edward said, returning with her cup and a small plate containing what appeared to be homemade biscotti. "I took the liberty of ordering these. My sweet tooth sometimes gets the better of my judgment." "Thank you." Clara wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic mug, grateful for something to do with her nervous energy. "This place is lovely. Do you come here often?" "Whenever I'm in this part of London, I have a weakness for authentic Italian coffee and owners who remember their customers' names." He settled back into his chair, studying her face with those perceptive dark eyes. "You look better than you did the other night." The directness of the observation should have made her uncomfortable, but instead, Clara found it refreshing. "I feel better. That evening was complicated." "The man who approached you," Edward said carefully. "Ex-boyfriend." Clara nodded, surprised by how easy it felt to talk to him. "Ex-everything, really. We lived together for 3 years. And it didn't end well." It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. "No. It took me a long time to realize that what I thought was love was actually," she searched for the right words, "control, manipulation. He had a way of making me question everything. My friends, my judgment, even my own memories of things that had happened." Edward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained gentle. "That must have been frightening. The scariest part was how gradual it was. Like being slowly poisoned. You don't realize how sick you are until you're barely functioning." Clara took a sip of her coffee, amazed at her own openness. "I haven't talked about this with anyone except my therapist." "I'm honored that you're sharing it with me." The sincerity in his voice made Clara look up from her coffee cup. "What about you? Any devastating relationship stories to share?" Edward's smile was rueful. "Nothing quite so dramatic. I've had relationships, but I've never lived with anyone. Never came close to marriage." "By choice?" "Partly." He leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "I lost my mother when I was 12. Cancer. My father never remarried, and I think watching him struggle with that loss made me cautious about emotional attachments." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of shared pain. "I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult." It was. But it also taught me something important about the difference between being alone and being lonely. Edward met her eyes directly. "I learned to be comfortable with solitude, but I also learned to recognize when someone was worth the risk of not being alone anymore." The weight of the statement hung between them, not quite a declaration, but something more significant than casual conversation. Clara felt her heart speed up slightly. "Your father?" she asked, partly to change the subject and partly because she was genuinely curious. "What does he do?" Something flickered across Edward's expression, so quickly she almost missed it. "He's retired now, used to run various businesses. These days, he's more interested in philanthropy than profit margins." It was a perfectly reasonable answer, but Clara sensed there was more to the story. Still, she understood the impulse to keep certain things private. After all, she'd shared more about her past with Marcus than she had with anyone except her therapist, but there were still aspects of that relationship she wasn't ready to discuss. "And you?" Edward asked. "What do you do when you're not rescuing yourself at charity galas?" Clara laughed, a sound that surprised her with its genuine lightness. "I work for a small marketing firm in South London. Nothing glamorous, but I like my colleagues, and the work doesn't follow me home at night." "That sounds like a healthy boundary." "I'm still learning about those," Clara admitted. "Turns out they're important." They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing easily from work to books to travel dreams. Edward was well-read and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that emerged when he felt comfortable. He asked questions that showed he was actually listening to her answers, and when she laughed at one of his stories about a disastrous attempt at cooking dinner for his father, Clara realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so naturally at ease with someone. As they prepared to leave, Edward hesitated at the cafe door. "Would you like to do this again? Perhaps dinner next time?" Clara's automatic response was to decline, to retreat back into the safety of her carefully constructed solitude. But something in Edward's expression, hopeful but not presumptuous, interested but respectful of her boundaries, made her pause. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. "But I should warn you, I'm probably not very good at this anymore." "At what?" "Dating. Trusting." Any of it, really. Edward's smile was gentle and patient. Then we'll figure it out together. Over the following weeks, Clara found herself looking forward to Edward's calls with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. They met for dinner twice more, conversations that stretched long into the evening, as they discovered shared interests and comfortable silences. He was easy to be with in a way that felt almost foreign after years of walking on eggshells around Marcus. Edward had a gift for making her feel heard. When she told him about her work developing marketing campaigns for small non-profits, he asked thoughtful questions about strategy and impact. When she mentioned her love of old films, he suggested a cinema in Notting Hill that specialized in classics. He never dominated conversations or redirected them back to himself, something Clara was still learning to appreciate. But there were things about Edward that didn't quite add up. He never mentioned where he lived, though he always seemed to know the best restaurants in whatever part of London they met. His clothes were beautifully made, but understated, the kind of quality that whispered rather than shouted about expense. When she'd asked about his work, he'd been vague, mentioning something about consulting for various organizations without providing specifics. Most intriguingly, he seemed to know people everywhere they went. Waiters greeted him by name. Maitre d's found them tables at restaurants that were supposedly fully booked, and more than once, Clara had noticed other diners glancing their way with expressions of recognition that Edward either didn't notice or chose to ignore. "You're very mysterious, you know," Clara said one evening as they walked along the south bank after dinner. The London eye glowed against the dark sky, and the Thames reflected the city lights like scattered jewels. Edward glanced at her, his expression carefully neutral. "Am I? Don't you think? I still don't know where you live, what you do for work, or anything about your family except that your father is retired." She kept her tone light, but Clara was beginning to wonder if Edward's secretiveness was something she should be concerned about. After Marcus, she'd promised herself she would never again ignore red flags or explain away inconsistencies in a partner's behavior. "I live in Kensington," Edward said after a moment, "and my work, it's complicated. Mostly I oversee funding for various charitable organizations. It's not particularly exciting." "Try me," Clara pressed gently. "I might surprise you with my capacity for finding boring things interesting." Edward stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands in his jacket pockets. The wind off the river ruffled his dark hair, and in the glow from the street lamps, Clara could see something troubled in his expression. "I don't talk about work much, because it tends to change how people see me," he said finally. "Money, especially significant amounts of it, makes people behave differently. They either want something from you, or they assume you couldn't possibly understand their problems, or they decide you must be arrogant or entitled." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Thames breeze. "Significant amounts? My family has been fortunate," Edward said carefully. "My great-grandfather made some very good investments, and subsequent generations have been good stewards of that fortune. These days, most of our wealth goes toward funding education, healthcare, and social services." It was a diplomatic answer, the kind of response that provided information without actually revealing anything meaningful. Clara recognized the technique because she'd used it herself when people asked too many questions about her relationship with Marcus. "Edward," she said slowly, "are you wealthy? Like, very wealthy?" He met her eyes directly, and she saw resignation there alongside something that looked almost like fear. "Yes, very wealthy." Clara absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the man who preferred small cafes to exclusive restaurants, who wore expensive clothes without apparent consciousness of their cost, who had never once mentioned money or material possessions during their conversations. "Are you upset?" Edward asked quietly. The honest answer was that Clara wasn't sure what she felt. Surprise, certainly, a kind of mental recalibration as she reassessed everything she thought she knew about him. But underneath those immediate reactions was something else, a growing understanding of why he might have been reluctant to share this information. "I'm trying to process it," she said honestly. "It explains some things. The way people look at you, the way doors seem to open wherever we go." "I wanted you to know me first," Edward said, his voice barely audible above the sound of the river. "Not what I have or what my name might mean. Just me." There was such vulnerability in the admission that Clara felt her heart clench. She thought about her own secrets, the parts of her story with Marcus that she hadn't shared, the ways she'd edited her past to make it more palatable for casual conversation. "We all have things we don't lead with," she said softly. "I understand the impulse to protect yourself." Edward's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I was afraid you'd think I was being deceptive." "Were you?" "No, just selective." Clara nodded slowly. She could work with selective. After all, she hadn't told him about the nights she still woke up in a panic, or the way certain tones of voice could send her into emotional freefall, or the fact that she sometimes caught herself checking over her shoulder when she was out alone, half expecting to see Marcus following her. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "That night at the gala, when I threw myself at you, did you know who I was? Had someone pointed me out or told you about my situation with Marcus?" Edward shook his head immediately. "I'd never seen you before in my life. I just saw a woman who was clearly terrified and decided to help, even though it could have been awkward or embarrassing for you." "Clara," Edward said, reaching for her hands, "I've been surrounded by wealth and privilege my entire life. I've seen what real distress looks like, and I've also seen what manufactured drama looks like. What I saw in your eyes that night was real fear, and no social embarrassment was worth more than helping someone who needed it." Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what? For helping a stranger? For being patient with my questions? For trusting me enough to tell me the truth about your family?" Edward's smile was soft and genuine. "Thank you for giving me a chance to be just Edward, at least for a while." As they resumed walking, Clara found herself thinking about identity and truth, about the ways people protected themselves, and the courage it took to let those protections down. Edward's wealth didn't change who he was as a person, but it did add a layer of complexity to their developing relationship that she would need to consider carefully. For now, though, it was enough to walk beside him in comfortable silence, their hands brushing occasionally as they moved through the London night. Clara was leaving her office building in South London when she saw the familiar figure leaning against the black BMW parked across the street. Her stomach dropped, and for a moment she considered turning around and going back inside, but Marcus had already seen her. He was walking toward her with that confident stride she remembered, his expression carefully arranged in what he probably thought was a charming smile. "Clara, what a coincidence," he said, as if his presence outside her workplace was purely accidental. "I was just in the neighborhood." "No, you weren't," Clara replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. 3 weeks ago, seeing Marcus unexpectedly had sent her into a panic attack. Today, while her heart was certainly racing, she felt more anger than fear. "Can't we have a civilized conversation?" Marcus asked, his tone suggesting that she was being unreasonable. "I've been thinking about you. About us." "There is no us, Marcus. There hasn't been for 18 months. Clara started walking toward the tube station, hoping he would take the hint and leave her alone. Instead, he fell into step beside her, maintaining the kind of close proximity that she recognized as a subtle form of intimidation. "You look good," he said, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Different, more confident. The observation was meant as a compliment, but Clara heard the underlying implication, that her confidence was something new, something that hadn't existed when they were together. The accuracy of that assessment only made it more infuriating. "Marcus, I need you to stop following me," she said firmly. "This is harassment." "Following you?" He laughed, the sound carrying that familiar edge of condescension. "Clara, you always were prone to dramatics. I'm simply trying to have a conversation with someone I care about." They had reached the entrance to the tube station, and Clara stopped walking. Around them, commuters streamed past in the evening rush, everyone focused on getting home after a long day. For a moment, Clara envied them their ordinary concerns, their freedom from unwanted encounters with manipulative ex-partners. "You don't care about me," she said, turning to face Marcus directly. "You care about control. You care about winning. You care about the fact that I left you, which wounded your ego." Marcus's carefully maintained expression flickered, revealing a flash of the anger that had always lurked beneath his charming facade. "That's not fair, Clara. Yes, I made mistakes, but I've changed. I've been in therapy, working on myself." "Good," Clara replied. "I'm glad you're getting help. But that doesn't mean we have anything to discuss." "We were together for 3 years," Marcus pressed, stepping closer. "Doesn't that count for something? Don't I deserve a chance to apologize properly, to show you that I'm different now?" Clara felt the familiar tug of guilt, the voice in her head that whispered maybe she was being too harsh, maybe everyone deserved a second chance. It was the same voice that had kept her trapped in their relationship for so long, the voice that had convinced her that his jealousy was love, his control was protection, his criticism was improvement. But standing there in the fading London daylight, Clara realized something had fundamentally shifted. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something stronger, a bone-deep certainty about what she would and would not accept in her life. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I need you to listen very carefully. I'm not the same person I was when we were together. I know what I want now, and I know what I don't want. I don't want to be with someone who monitors my phone calls or criticizes my friends. I don't want to be with someone who makes me question my own judgment or who treats disagreement as betrayal. I never—" "Yes, you did," Clara interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "You did all of those things and more. And the worst part is that you convinced me it was normal, that it was love. But it wasn't love, Marcus. It was control. And it nearly destroyed me." Marcus's face was hardening now, the mask of charming repentance beginning to slip. "So what? You're just going to throw away everything we had, 3 years of our lives?" "I'm not throwing anything away," Clara replied. "I'm choosing to build something better." "With him?" Marcus's voice carried a sneer now. "That man from the gala. Do you even know who he is? Do you know what kind of family he comes from?" Clara felt a chill of unease. How did Marcus know about Edward's family? Had he been investigating her new relationship? "That's not your concern," she said firmly. "Isn't it? Clara, you've always been naive about people's motivations. What if he's just playing with you? What if this is all some kind of game to him?" The words hit their target, awakening insecurities Clara had been trying to ignore. Edward's wealth, his secretiveness about his background, his easy familiarity with exclusive venues. What if Marcus was right? What if she was being naive again? But even as the doubts surfaced, Clara recognized them for what they were. Marcus's final manipulation, his attempt to undermine her confidence in her own judgment. It was exactly the kind of psychological warfare he'd always excelled at. "My relationships are not your business," she said coldly, "and your opinion of my judgment is not something I value." Without waiting for his response, Clara turned and walked into the tube station, not looking back even when she heard him call her name. Her hands were shaking as she tapped her Oyster card and made her way to the platform, but she kept walking. As she stood waiting for the Northern Line train, Clara allowed herself a moment to process what had just happened. For the first time since leaving Marcus, she had faced him directly and held her ground. She hadn't apologized for his behavior or taken responsibility for his feelings. She hadn't let him make her doubt her own perceptions. When her phone buzzed with a text message from Edward asking if she was free for dinner, Clara found herself smiling, despite the lingering adrenaline from her encounter with Marcus. "Would love to," she typed back. "I have something to tell you." As the train pulled into the station, Clara realized that she was looking forward to sharing her small victory with Edward. She wanted to tell someone who would understand why standing up to Marcus had been significant, someone who would be proud of her for finding her voice. The thought brought with it a flutter of warmth, and Clara acknowledged what she had been afraid to admit even to herself. Somewhere in the past few weeks, Edward had become more than just a pleasant distraction or a safe companion. He had become someone she trusted, someone she cared about, someone she might even be falling in love with. Clara was walking past the newsstand near her tube station the following morning when she saw it. Edward's face staring back at her from the cover of the Financial Times weekend magazine, his photograph positioned above the headline, "The Philanthropist Prince, Edward Hawthorne's Quiet Revolution in Charitable Giving." For a moment she simply stood there, commuters flowing around her like water around a stone. The Edward in the photograph looked polished and authoritative in a way that was simultaneously familiar and completely foreign. This was Edward in his element, photographed in what appeared to be an elegant office with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and art that looked genuinely expensive rather than decorative. With hands that trembled slightly, Clara purchased the magazine and found a nearby cafe where she could read the article in private. What she discovered made her feel as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Edward Hawthorne wasn't just wealthy. He was heir to one of Britain's oldest and most influential families. The Hawthorne Foundation, which he had been running since his father's retirement 3 years ago, controlled assets worth over £2 billion. The article detailed his innovative approaches to philanthropy, his Oxford education, and his family's centuries-long history of public service. There were quotes from government ministers, university chancellors, and heads of major charities, all praising Edward's vision and leadership. He was described as a man who could have lived a life of pure privilege, but had instead chosen to dedicate himself to solving social problems. It was a glowing profile of an impressive man, and Clara barely recognized him as the person who had taken her to small cafes and walked with her along the Thames. Mr. Hawthorne is notably private about his personal life, the article noted near the end. Despite his eligibility and prominence, he has never been publicly linked to any romantic relationships, preferring to let his philanthropic work speak for itself. Clara read that paragraph 3 times, each reading adding another layer to her growing sense of betrayal. Not only had Edward hidden the full extent of his wealth and influence, but apparently his privacy extended to keeping their entire relationship secret. Was she just another one of his charitable projects? A damaged woman he was helping out of the kindness of his heart. She thought about all their conversations, looking for signs she had missed. His careful deflections when she asked about his work. His reluctance to talk about his family. The way he had seemed genuinely concerned about her reaction when he'd admitted to being very wealthy, a description that now seemed almost laughably inadequate. Clara's phone rang, and Edward's name appeared on the screen. For a moment she considered answering, demanding explanations. Instead, she let it go to voicemail and gathered her things to leave the cafe. Walking back to her flat, Clara found herself remembering Marcus's words from the previous evening. "Do you even know who he is? Do you know what kind of family he comes from?" At the time, she had dismissed his questions as manipulative attempts to undermine her confidence. Now she wondered if Marcus had known exactly who Edward was, if he had been trying to warn her in his own twisted way. Back in her apartment, Clara spread the magazine open on her kitchen table and studied the photograph again. This Edward looked like someone who belonged on magazine covers, someone who moved effortlessly through the highest levels of society, someone who would never need to throw himself at a stranger at a charity gala because he would never be in a situation where he lacked control or safety. She thought about the other women he must know, daughters of politicians, heiresses, accomplished professionals from families like his own. What was she in comparison? A marketing assistant with a history of poor judgment in relationships. Someone who had needed rescuing at a party and had continued to need careful handling ever since. Clara's phone buzzed with a text from Edward. "Missed your call. Free for lunch today. There's something I'd like to discuss." She stared at the message for several minutes before typing back, "I'm busy today and tomorrow. I need some time to think." His response came quickly. "Clara, what's wrong? Did something happen with Marcus again?" The fact that his first assumption was that Marcus had done something to upset her only reinforced Clara's growing conviction that Edward saw her as fragile, as someone who needed protection rather than partnership. She turned off her phone without responding. Over the next few days, Clara found herself analyzing every interaction she'd had with Edward, looking for signs of condescension or pity that she might have missed. Had his gentleness been genuine care or careful management? When he'd listened to her stories about Marcus, had he been moved by her strength in leaving, or had he simply been cataloguing another charity case? The worst part was how much she missed him. Despite her anger and hurt, Clara found herself reaching for her phone to share small moments with him. A funny incident at work, an interesting article she'd read, the way the light looked on the Thames during her evening runs. The impulse to include him in her daily life had become automatic, which only made her feel more foolish. Sarah called on Thursday evening, her voice bright with curiosity. "So tell me about this mysterious man you've been seeing. You've been remarkably tight-lipped about him." "There's nothing to tell," Clara replied, curled up on her sofa with a mug of tea and a half-hearted attempt at reading. "Nothing to tell? Clara, you've been practically glowing these past few weeks, and now you sound like someone stole your puppy. What happened?" Clara closed her book and sighed. "I found out he wasn't exactly honest with me about who he is." "Married?" Sarah's voice sharpened with protective concern. "No, just significantly more important than he led me to believe. As in, heir to a billionaire fortune and runs one of the largest charitable foundations in the country. Important." There was a pause. "Edward Hawthorne?" Clara sat up straight. "You know who he is?" "Clara, everyone knows who he is. His family has been prominent for generations, but he's got a reputation for being incredibly private and down-to-earth despite his background. Are you sure you're not overreacting?" "He lied to me, Sarah." "Did he? Or did he just not lead with his family history? Because honestly, if I were in his position, I'd probably do the same thing. Do you know how many people would be interested in him purely for his money and connections?" Clara felt a flicker of uncertainty. "But why didn't he trust me enough to tell me the truth?" "Maybe because he wanted you to know him first, not his bank balance." "Clara, think about it. You've spent the last year and a half rebuilding your ability to trust your own judgment about people. If he had told you who he was on the first date, would you have been able to see past all that external stuff to who he actually is?" The question hit uncomfortably close to home. Clara thought about her initial reaction to discovering Edward's identity, the way she had immediately begun questioning his motives and her own worth. Would she have been able to develop genuine feelings for him if she had known from the beginning that he was one of the most eligible bachelors in Britain? "Maybe not," she admitted reluctantly. "So perhaps he was protecting both of you by letting the relationship develop naturally first." Clara wanted to argue, but she could hear the logic in Sarah's words. Still, the hurt lingered, along with a deeper fear that she was once again misjudging a man's character, falling for someone who wasn't who she thought he was. "I just don't know how to trust my instincts anymore," Clara said quietly. "What if I'm being naive again? What if this is all some kind of elaborate game to him?" "Clara," Sarah said gently, "from everything you've told me about Edward, does he strike you as someone who would play games with people's emotions? Has he ever made you feel small or manipulated or controlled?" "No," Clara admitted. The opposite, actually. Then maybe the question isn't whether you can trust him, but whether you can trust yourself to recognize when someone is treating you well. After hanging up, Clara sat in her quiet apartment, thinking about trust and fear, about the ways trauma could make you doubt even good things. She thought about Edward's patience with her questions, his respect for her boundaries, the way he had never once made her feel like she owed him anything for his kindness. But she also thought about the magazine article, the life of privilege and influence that he had kept hidden from her. Even if his motives had been good, the deception still stung. How could they have a real relationship if he felt he needed to hide fundamental aspects of who he was? Her phone had been buzzing periodically with messages from Edward, not demanding or angry, but concerned and increasingly worried. She had read them all, but hadn't responded, unsure what to say or how to bridge the gap that had opened between them. Finally, on Friday evening, she received a longer message. "Clara, I don't know what I've done to upset you, but I can't stand the thought that you might be hurt or angry without understanding why. I'm going to be at our cafe in Covent Garden tomorrow at 2 p.m. I'll wait there until closing time if necessary. If you don't come, I'll respect that as your answer and won't contact you again, but I hope you'll give me a chance to explain whatever I've done wrong." Clara read the message 3 times, hearing Edward's voice in the words, imagining him sitting alone in the little cafe where they'd had their first real conversation. The image made her chest tight with longing and regret. Clara arrived at the cafe 15 minutes late, partly from nerves and partly from changing her mind 3 times about whether to come at all. Through the window, she could see Edward sitting at their usual corner table, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that appeared to have gone cold long ago. He was staring out at the street with an expression of resignation that made Clara's heart clench. When she pushed through the door, his head turned immediately, hope flickering across his features before settling into something more cautious. He half rose from his chair, then seemed to think better of it and remained seated. "You came," he said simply. "I almost didn't." Clara slipped into the chair across from him, noting the careful distance he maintained, the way he kept his hands on the table where she could see them. Even in his obvious distress, he was being mindful of her comfort. "Thank you for giving me the chance to explain," Edward said. "Though I should start by admitting that I'm not entirely sure what I'm explaining. I know you're upset with me, but I don't know why." Clara pulled the folded magazine from her bag and placed it on the table between them. Edward's eyes widened slightly as he took in the cover, understanding dawning on his face. "Ah," he said quietly. "I see." "Do you?" Clara's voice was sharper than she'd intended. "Because I'm not sure I see anything clearly anymore. I thought I knew who you were, Edward. I thought we were getting to know each other honestly." Edward was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the magazine cover. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "What did you think when you read this article?" "I thought about how many lies you must have told me," Clara replied, "about how naive I must have seemed, telling you about my little marketing job and my small flat, while you were probably used to socializing with celebrities and politicians." "And?" Edward prompted gently. Clara felt her composure beginning to crack. "I thought about how I must look to you, another broken woman for you to fix through your charitable foundation." "Clara." "No. Let me finish." The words were coming faster now, fueled by weeks of suppressed hurt and confusion. I wondered if this was all some kind of elaborate social experiment. Take a damaged woman, show her some kindness, see if you can rehabilitation her into someone worthy of your circles. Edward's face had gone very still, but Clara could see something blazing in his dark eyes. "Is that really what you think of me?" "I don't know what to think anymore. This article talks about your family's centuries of public service, your Oxford education, your ability to move seamlessly through the highest levels of society. And then there's me, a woman who needed to be rescued at a party because she couldn't handle seeing her ex-boyfriend." "You didn't need to be rescued," Edward said quietly. "You needed an ally. There's a difference, is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like you've been managing me this entire time. Careful conversations in small cafes, gentle questions about my past, patient explanations of things I didn't understand. It all feels very therapeutic. Edward leaned back in his chair, and Clara could see him processing her words, trying to understand how they had arrived at this point. "May I tell you something?" he asked finally. Clara nodded, though her posture remained defensive. "The night we met, when you threw yourself into my arms, my first thought wasn't that you needed rescuing. It was that you were incredibly brave. You saw a threat, assessed your options, and took action to protect yourself. You used your intelligence and your instincts to get yourself out of a dangerous situation." Clara felt something shift inside her chest, but she wasn't ready to let go of her anger yet. "That's a very generous interpretation of a panic attack." "It wasn't a panic attack," Edward said firmly. "It was strategic thinking under pressure. And everything you've told me about leaving Marcus, rebuilding your life, creating boundaries for yourself. Clara, you're one of the strongest people I've ever met." "Then why didn't you trust me with the truth about who you are?" Edward was quiet for a long moment, and Clara could see him struggling with something. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with honesty. "Because I was terrified," he admitted. "Not of you, but of what knowing about my background might do to us. I've watched my entire life as relationships change when money enters the equation. I've seen people I cared about become different versions of themselves, more deferential, more calculating, or sometimes more demanding." He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Clara recognized as nervous. "But more than that, I was afraid that if you knew who I was, you might decide you weren't good enough for me, which would be completely backward, because the truth is, I've been wondering since our first conversation whether I'm good enough for you." Clara blinked, caught off guard by the vulnerability in his admission. "What do you mean?" "Clara, you survived something that would have broken many people, and you came out of it with your compassion and your humor and your capacity for trust intact. You rebuilt your entire life from nothing. You work for organizations that actually make a difference in the world, not because it looks good on your family's charitable giving reports, but because you believe in the work." Edward leaned forward, his eyes intense and sincere. "I was born into privilege I did nothing to earn. Yes, I try to use it responsibly, but I've never had to overcome real adversity. I've never had to rebuild my life or question my fundamental assumptions about trust and safety. You have, and you did it with a grace and strength that amazes me." Clara felt her carefully constructed anger beginning to crumble. "But you lied to me about who you are." "I omitted information," Edward corrected gently. "I never lied about who I am as a person. Everything I've shared with you about my thoughts, my feelings, my values, that's all been completely honest. I just didn't lead with my family history because I wanted you to know me first." "The article says you've never been publicly linked to anyone romantically," Clara said, the words coming out smaller than she'd intended. Edward's expression softened. "Because I've never cared enough about anyone to risk the scrutiny that comes with dating someone in my position. But I care about you, Clara, enough to risk it if you're willing." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of Edward's words settling between them. Clara found herself thinking about fear and trust, about the ways people protected themselves and the courage required to be vulnerable. "I read this article, and I felt like I didn't know you at all," she said finally. "And I was afraid that if you read that article, you'd decide you didn't want to know me at all," Edward replied. Clara looked across the table at Edward, really looked at him. She saw the man who had held her without question when she was afraid, who had listened to her stories without judgment, who had been patient with her boundaries and respectful of her healing process. She also saw someone who had his own fears and insecurities, his own reasons for being careful with his heart. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to have a relationship with someone whose life is so different from mine." "Neither do I," Edward said honestly. But I'd like to try, if you're willing to figure it out together. Clara reached across the table and touched his hand, noting how his fingers immediately turned to intertwine with hers. "I was so hurt when I saw that magazine," she said, "and scared. I thought maybe I was being naive again, falling for someone who wasn't who I thought they were. I understand why you'd be afraid of that, and I'm sorry I handled this badly. I should have found a way to tell you myself before you found out from a magazine article." Clara nodded, then asked the question that had been haunting her for days. "What happens now? If we try to make this work, what does that actually look like? Your world, your responsibilities. Where do I fit in all of that?" Edward's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Wherever you want to fit. Clara, I'm not asking you to change who you are or give up the life you've built. I'm asking if you'd be willing to let me be part of it, and to be part of mine." Looking into his eyes, Clara realized that the fear she'd been carrying wasn't really about Edward's deception or their different backgrounds. It was about the possibility of being truly happy, truly safe with someone again. It was about whether she was brave enough to trust not just Edward, but herself. "I'd like that," she said softly. "But I need us to be honest with each other from now on. No more omissions, no more protecting each other from difficult truths." "Agreed," Edward said immediately. "Complete honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. And I need time to process all of this. Your world, what it means, how it changes things between us." "All the time you need," Edward assured her. Clara smiled, feeling lighter than she had in days. "Then I think we should start over, properly this time." Edward's answering smile was radiant. Chapter 8. The return to the cafe door. 3 weeks had passed since Clara and Edward's conversation at the cafe, 3 weeks of carefully rebuilding trust and learning to navigate the complex realities of their different worlds. They had taken things slowly, Edward patiently answering Clara's questions about his family's history and his work, while Clara gradually opened up about the deeper aspects of her relationship with Marcus. Now, on a crisp Saturday morning, Clara found herself walking toward the same Covent Garden cafe where so much of their relationship had unfolded. Edward had suggested they meet there for coffee, just as they had in the beginning. But this time, Clara felt the weight of everything that had changed between them. As she approached the familiar storefront, Clara was surprised to see Edward standing outside, his hands in his jacket pockets, looking uncharacteristically nervous. When he saw her coming, his face lit up with that smile she had come to love, but she could see something anxious in his eyes. "You're not usually one for dramatic gestures," Clara observed as she reached him. "Everything all right?" "Actually," Edward said, "there's something I need to tell you. And I thought we should have this conversation where we had our first real talk." Clara felt her stomach flutter with nerves. Over the past few weeks, she had begun to believe that they had worked through the major obstacles in their relationship. Edward's honesty about his background had been complete and unflinching, and Clara had felt increasingly comfortable with the idea of being part of his world. But the serious expression on his face suggested there was something else. "Should I be worried?" she asked. "I hope not," Edward replied, but his smile was uncertain. "Shall we go in?" The cafe was busier than usual for a Saturday morning, but their corner table was available almost as if it had been waiting for them. Edward held Clara's chair as she sat down, a gesture that had become natural between them over the weeks. "Coffee," he offered. "Edward," Clara said gently, "whatever you need to tell me, just tell me. The suspense is making me nervous." He nodded and sat across from her, his hands clasped on the table. "Do you remember when you asked me about marriage, about why I'd never come close to it?" Clara nodded, remembering their conversation from weeks ago. "I told you it was because I was cautious about emotional attachments after losing my mother, and that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." Clara felt her heart rate increase, but she kept her voice steady. "What's the rest of it?" "I've never believed in marriage as an institution," Edward said quietly. Growing up in the circles I did, I saw too many marriages that were business arrangements, strategic alliances between families. I saw people who stayed together for appearances or financial benefit rather than love. I convinced myself that genuine partnership was impossible when money and social status were involved. Clara absorbed this information, trying to understand where the conversation was heading. And now, Edward met her eyes directly, and Clara saw vulnerability there alongside something that looked like hope. Now, I'm sitting across from a woman who makes me want to reconsider every assumption I've ever made about love and commitment. A woman who chose me when she thought I was just a consultant who lived in Kensington, and who chose me again when she learned about my family and my responsibilities. Clara's breath caught in her throat as understanding began to dawn. Clara, Edward continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction, I know we've only been together for a few months, and I know we've had to work through some significant trust issues, but I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. I've never met anyone who challenges me to be better while accepting exactly who I am. He reached across the table and took her hands in his touch warm and steady. I don't want to wait years to build a life with you. I don't want to waste time being cautious when I'm already completely certain about how I feel. So I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to know that whatever your answer is, I'll respect it completely. Clara felt tears pricking at her eyes as Edward shifted in his chair, and she realized what was about to happen. Clara Sullivan, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Will you marry me? For a moment, Clara couldn't speak. The question hung in the air between them, enormous and life-changing and completely unexpected. She looked into Edward's eyes and saw her entire future there, a future she had never dared to imagine for herself. Edward, she whispered. I know it's soon, he said quickly, misreading her hesitation. I know we still have things to work through, and I know my world can be complicated. But Clara, I love you. I love your strength and your humor and the way you see the world. I love that you call me on my nonsense and that you make me laugh when I take myself too seriously. Clara felt the tears spilling over now, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of pure joy, of recognition, of coming home. I love you too, she said, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the cafe. I love you so much, it terrifies me sometimes. Is that a yes? Edward asked, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. Clara thought about the woman she had been 18 months ago, afraid, controlled, convinced that she was fundamentally unworthy of real love. Then she thought about the woman she was now, strong, independent, capable of setting boundaries and asking for what she needed. Most importantly, she thought about the man sitting across from her who had seen both versions of her and loved them equally. Yes, she said, laughing through her tears. Yes, Edward, I'll marry you. But the smile that broke across Edward's face was radiant, transforming his usually composed features into something boyish and unguarded. He brought her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. But I should warn you, it's been in my family for several generations, so if it's not to your taste, we can find something else. He produced a small velvet box and placed it on the table between them. Clara opened it with trembling fingers and gasped at what she found inside. The ring was exquisite, but not ostentatious. A classic solitaire diamond set in a delicate vintage band that looked like it belonged on her hand. It was my great-grandmother's, Edward explained. She was reportedly the first person in the family to marry for love rather than social advantage. My grandfather always said she set a dangerous precedent. Clara slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how perfectly it fit, how right it looked there. It's perfect, she said. She had good taste. She also had the good sense to marry a man who adored her completely, Edward replied. I like to think she'd approve of you. As Clara looked at the ring sparkling on her finger, she felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This wasn't the fairy tale ending she had dreamed of as a young woman. It was better. It was real, built on mutual respect and genuine partnership, forged through honesty and patience and the courage to be vulnerable with each other. So, what happens now? Clara asked, intertwining her fingers with Edward's across the table. Now we figure it out together, Edward replied. Just like we always have. Clara smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a desperate embrace at a charity gala to a proposal in a small cafe in Covent Garden. It hadn't been the smoothest path, but it had been theirs. I love you, Edward Hawthorne, she said. And I love you, future Mrs. Hawthorne, he replied, bringing their joined hands to his lips once more. 6 months later, Clara walked through the bustling Saturday market in Borough Market, her engagement ring catching the morning light as she examined a display of fresh herbs. The vendor, a cheerful elderly woman with soil under her fingernails, was explaining the difference between various types of basil with the kind of passionate expertise that made Clara smile. The purple one is lovely in salads, the woman was saying, but if you're making pesto, you want the Genovese, nothing else will do. I'll take some of both, Clara decided, adding the herbs to her growing collection of market finds. She had discovered a love for cooking in recent months, something that surprised her, given her previously limited culinary ambitions. But there was something deeply satisfying about creating meals from scratch, about the meditation of chopping vegetables, and the alchemy of combining simple ingredients into something nourishing and delicious. Clara! She turned to see Edward approaching through the crowd, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of relaxed weekend clothes that still occasionally surprised her. Today it was dark jeans and a navy sweater, his hair slightly mussed from the autumn wind. He looked nothing like the formal figure from magazine covers and charity galas, and everything like the man who had held her when she was afraid. Perfect timing, she said, accepting the coffee gratefully. Mrs. Patterson just taught me everything I never knew I needed to know about basil. Edward smiled at the vendor, who beamed back at him with the kind of maternal approval Clara had noticed he inspired in older women everywhere they went. Edward's teaching this one to cook, Mrs. Patterson confided to Clara, as if sharing a delicious secret. Takes a patient man to do that properly. Hey, Clara protested with mock indignation. I'm not that hopeless in the kitchen. Remember the risotto incident, Edward said solemnly. That was one time, and the smoke alarm was overly sensitive. Mrs. Patterson laughed delightedly, wrapping Clara's herbs in brown paper. You keep this one, dear. He's got kind eyes. As they walked away from the stall, Clara slipped her free hand into Edward's, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. The early weeks of their engagement had required some adjustment, learning to navigate the increased attention that came with being linked to Edward publicly, finding the balance between her independent life and their shared one. But they had approached each challenge the same way they had approached everything else, with honesty, patience, and genuine partnership. How did the meeting go? Clara asked, referring to Edward's morning session with the architects who were designing a new community centre in East London. Better than expected. They've incorporated all the feedback from the community sessions, and the design is really something special. The kids are going to have an amazing space for after-school programs. Clara smiled, remembering the community meetings they had attended together, where Edward had listened carefully to parents and teenagers alike, taking notes on what they actually wanted, rather than what he thought they needed. It was one of the things she loved most about him, his ability to use his privilege and resources without condescension, to see his wealth as a tool for empowerment rather than charity. Speaking of which, Edward continued. The Foundation Board wants to meet with you next week about the Youth Mentorship Program proposal. Clara felt a familiar flutter of nerves mixed with excitement. 3 months ago, she had left her job at the small marketing firm to work full-time developing programs for the Hawthorne Foundation. It was challenging work that combined her professional skills with her personal understanding of what it meant to rebuild your life from scratch. "Are you nervous?" Edward asked, reading her expression with the intuitive accuracy that still amazed her. "Terrified," Clara admitted, "but the good kind of terrified." They paused at a flower stall, where Edward selected a small bouquet of white roses without being asked. It was another gesture that had become routine, bringing Clara flowers for no reason other than that he knew they made her smile. "Thank you," she said, accepting the roses and breathing in their delicate scent. "You know you don't have to buy me flowers every week, right?" "I know," Edward replied. "I want to." As they made their way toward the exit of the market, Clara caught sight of her reflection in a shop window and was struck by how different she looked from the woman who had thrown herself into Edward's arms at a charity gala 8 months ago. There was confidence in her posture now, joy in her expression, and a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with Edward's social status and everything to do with being truly known and accepted by someone who mattered to her. "What are you thinking about?" Edward asked, noticing her moment of contemplation. "Just all of this," Clara said, gesturing at the market around them, the flowers in her arms, the easy comfort of walking through London with him on a Saturday morning. "Sometimes I can't quite believe this is my life now." "Good unbelievable or concerning unbelievable?" Clara laughed. "Definitely good. It's just that a year ago I was convinced that I was fundamentally broken, that I'd never be able to trust anyone again or build something healthy with another person. And now, Now I'm engaged to a man I love completely, doing work that matters to me, and buying herbs at Borough Market because I've apparently become someone who cooks elaborate meals on weekends." She shook her head in amazement. "It's not the life I thought I wanted, Edward. It's better." Edward stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression serious despite the smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Clara Hawthorne to be," he said formally, "I need you to know something." "What's that, Edward Hawthorne to be?" she replied, matching his mock-serious tone. "You were never broken. Hurt, yes, recovering certainly, but never broken. The woman I fell in love with that first night was already whole. You just needed time to remember it." Clara felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came when Edward said something particularly meaningful, the emotion that still surprised her with its intensity. "I love you," she said simply, because sometimes there weren't adequate words for the fullness of what she felt. "I love you too," Edward replied, leaning down to kiss her forehead gently. "Now come on, future wife. You promised to make me lunch with those expensive herbs, and I'm holding you to it." As they walked toward the tube station, their arms full of market treasures and their hands intertwined, Clara found herself thinking about fate and choice, about the random moments that change everything and the daily decisions that sustain love over time. She had thrown herself into Edward's arms out of pure desperation, seeking nothing more than temporary safety from an unwanted encounter. What she had found instead was a partner who challenged her to grow while accepting exactly who she was, someone who used his considerable resources to make the world better, and who brought her flowers every week simply because it made her happy. Sometimes, Clara thought, running towards safety led you exactly where you were supposed to be all along. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the stranger you chose in a moment of panic turned out to be the person you would choose again and again, every single day, for the rest of your life. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters are the ones life prepares most carefully. What about you? Have you ever experienced something that seemed unlikely, but changed everything? Tell me in the comments. I read each story with care. If this story touched you, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel. Here, each story is more than a tale. It's a mirror of the soul. Until next time.